Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first of our series of thinning meeting webinars for the Capital Region. I'm Mike Basedow, a tree fruit specialist with the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program. Before we begin, I'd like to make a shout out to our commercial sponsor, OESCO in Conway, Massachusetts, with a big thank you for their financial support for our series. The people at OESCO would like to thank everybody for this opportunity. I'm reminded that they are here for you with parts, service, and sales support through these stressful times. OESCO may be reached at 413-369-4335, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Our focus today will be multidisciplinary, covering fruit set and early thinning strategies with Dr. Terence Robinson of Cornell University, Agritech, insect pest management with Peter Jentsch, disease management with Dr. Srdjan Acimovic, and fruit quality effects of drape net on sunburn with Donahue Acimovic, all of whom are coming from the Cornell Hudson Valley Lab. We will then hear a few comments about bitter pit suppression and harvest prediction with Dan Donahue, also a fruit specialist from the Cornell Cooperative Extension Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program. I will then briefly discuss post-bloom weed management strategies. Natasha Field, our technician on the team located in the Capital Region, is co-hosted with me today, and she'll be monitoring the chat box for questions as they come up. We will then give each speaker the opportunity to answer your questions at the conclusion of each of their presentations, so please feel free to type them into the chat box as we go along today. With that, I'll turn it over to Terence Robinson.
So I begin with just a review of what we hope you'll be able to accomplish this year in your thinning program. We've talked a number of years now about the precision chemical thinning strategy, which is a sequential spray strategy to try to get crop load down to a target fruit number. This is particularly critical on biennial bearing varieties. And the current version of this precision approach starts with a bloom spray. And we use the pollen tube growth model for that. As I looked around the Capital District yesterday, we're a little bit past that particular opportunity, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it because I know there are some Champlain people that are listening in, and we're still in the window to start the pollen tube growth model and spray some sprays during bloom. If you did put on bloom sprays, then you're well on your way. This year, however, it was a little bit complicated because of frost damage, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. So if you didn't spray anything at bloom, we next have the opportunity coming up at petal fall, and there we try to guide that spray with a carbon balance model. After that spray is our first opportunity to try to assess what we have, and we prefer to use the fruit growth rate model where we measure diameters of fruit to determine exactly how many fruits are still on the tree or still growing. If we're close to our target number with that petal fall spray, we stop there. But in most years, we have to follow that up with a spray between 10 and 13 millimeters. And then we generally measure fruits again and determine how many are still growing to see if we've gotten close to the target number. And if we have, we stop. But in some years, neither of the petal fall spray nor the 10 millimeter spray works very well. Thus, we have one last opportunity to spray when fruits are quite large, between 16 and 20 millimeters. Now, there's really not great options at that point in time. However, we are researching two new chemicals that will work both at this very large fruit size as rescue thinning treatments, but they're not yet labeled, so I'm not going to talk about them. But I do have my preferred mix of three chemicals at that large fruit size that has worked fairly well. So let me talk just a little bit about bloom thinning in 2020. The pre-bloom frosts up and down the Hudson Valley and in the Capital District have damaged king flowers. Now in some blocks, the damage is quite high, and therefore bloom thinning is not warranted. But even where damage is moderate, it still makes it a little bit risky because blossom thinning is predicated on saving those first king flowers and making your crop based on those king flowers. But when they're damaged, then they may not set and you may end up over thinning your block. However, it is clear to me after working particularly with Honeycrisp and Fuji that bloom thinning is essential to maintain repeat bloom in those two varieties. Therefore, we really have to learn how to do blossom thinning in New York State to manage those two varieties well. I show here just a little bit of data from a few years ago in one of our Honeycrisp trials at Geneva. So the data that I'm showing is a trial with Honeycrisp where we compared a number of different thinning options and where we got the best repeat bloom. And you see that on the bottom, the unthinned control repeated only about 10% of the spurs with a flower cluster. Where we sprayed ATS at full bloom, that increased it to close to 50%. If we combined ATS with some later Maxellin 7, it was up in the 75% range. ATS seemed to be a key to trying to get repeat bloom. If you look at just thinning at petal fall with NAN7, repeat bloom was still below 25%. So over the years, this treatment where we've had something at full bloom has been the most successful to get repeat bloom. And so we continue to suggest that that's essential. Now, for those of you that are in the Champlain Valley, I think there's a great opportunity to blossom thin. And so I want to just give a little bit of a instruction on what I would do if I were there. At bloom time, there's a number of chemicals that are available to spray. Ammonium thiosulfate is legal if it's sprayed as a foliar nitrogen nutrient. Lime sulfur is not legal to spray in New York. We don't have a label for it during bloom. The label of Miller's lime sulfur prohibits sprays at bloom. The other hormone type thinners are legal to spray at bloom. Generally, the hormone type thinners don't thin as well at bloom as does ammonium thiosulfate. So we suggest ATS. My suggestion for managing blossom thinning is to definitely use the pollen tube growth model, and I think Mike's going to run some trials up there. But we start by measuring style length. Usually those measurements should be somewhere between 8 and 12 millimeters. If you strip too much of the sepals away from the flower when you measure how long the style is, you sometimes get measurements much larger than that, and those are wrong. So you leave the sepals on the flower and measure from the top of the sepal to the tip of the style. Once you have that measurement or an average of a certain number of flowers in your block, then you start looking at the tree's bloom and determining when you have enough king flowers open to start the model. So for example, on many Honeycrisp trees that are planted in a tall spindle format, our target, if the trees are mature, is somewhere between 80 and 100 apples. Let's just, for this discussion, say our target is 80 apples. We would wait until 80 flower clusters are open, or 80 king flowers are open. Then we would start the model. That might be at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a particular day, or it might be at 10 in the morning, but you try to keep an eye on it so you can start at an exact time. Now, I'm talking with Mike before the meeting. I think in the Champlain, you're getting close to that today or tomorrow. So probably sometime today or early tomorrow, you would get to the point where enough king flowers are open to then start the model clock. The model is essentially a clock based upon temperature that calculates how long pollen tube grain take to grow down that style to fertilize a flower. And the model is built so that it shows you what percent of the style length the pollen tube has traversed. In theory, we would wait until you get to 100%, meaning the pollen tube has grown down that style to 100%, and then spray. And that has worked well on the West Coast for lime sulfur, which is the most common spray there. However, here, where we don't have a label for lime sulfur and we depend on ATS, it has not worked so well. ATS is a weaker chemical thinner, and in my opinion so far is that it doesn't burn as much of the style as does lime sulfur. Therefore, to kill pollen tube growth in non-target flowers, you have to spray sooner. So we've suggested for the last, this will be the second year, to spray with ATS when it reaches 60%, not 100%. Then you would restart the model and spray again when it reaches 60%. The challenge this year is that there may be some blocks that have king flower damage. So I would ask that every person who wants to put on blossom thinning ATS look at their block and make a numeric assessment of what damage there is. It's pretty simple. You just take the flower and you look at the pistil and see if it looks good, and then you split it apart with your thumbnail and look down through that and see if it's green all the way to the base. And do about 50 flowers and keep track with a numeric count of good flowers and damaged flowers. If you have 40% of the king flowers damaged, I suggest you not use ATS. It's still possible to spray a hormone type spray a little later, about when 80% of all flowers are open, which might probably be later this week. So those are just two little things I would like to emphasize for this particular year. I haven't been to the Champlain. I'm planning to go there next week. But hearing from Mike, I think there's much less frost damage there than there is in the Hudson Valley and the Capital District. But please go look at the block and determine what percent of the kings are healthy versus damaged. Now, for most of the people in the Capital District, we're past the point of putting on a blossom thinning spray. Now, when I was there yesterday, there's still some varieties that have a lot of petals on and still in bloom. And so it is possible to go in with an NA spray and call it a bloom thinning spray. And that's very, very valuable on the two hardest to manage varieties for biennial bearing, which are Honeycrisp and Fuji. So if you would like to still spray NAA on either Honeycrisp or Fuji in the Capital District, I think it's possible. Now, let me just specifically talk about the damage that I saw yesterday. And Mike alerted me to this. It's very variable. There's some places where there seemed to be almost no damage on some varieties. Other varieties in that same orchard did have some damage. But there's some orchards that had tremendous damage. And those orchards that had a lot of damage have to be very cautious when overthinning, or when thinning, because of possible overthinning. So in a year where you have damage to flowers, often we will take a very cautious approach at petal fall and at 10 millimeters until we can really determine how many fruits are really growing by measuring diameters and using the fruit growth rate model. That model will tell us exactly how many fruits are on the tree. And if we don't even have enough fruits, we'll simply avoid putting on a 10 millimeter spray. Now, I want to emphasize that the carbohydrate model is a key to this post-bloom thinning because it helps us avoid over-thinning. There's both a web-based version and a mobile phone version. It's titled Malusim, and it's available on either the Apple App Store or the Android App Store. I would encourage you to download it to your phone. It's free. Then when you've downloaded it, you can set up a block in that program, and within about 15 seconds on any place on your farm, you can click a few buttons and get an updated model output to try to guide you in avoiding overthinning situations. I emphasize also that we've added a new feature last year, which is a degree day calculator based on a slightly different base than most insect models, which calculates when we're in the critical and optimum point of time to spray the 10 millimeter spray. So I'd like you to try to remember these numbers that I have down. The optimum timing for best thinning is between 200 and 250 degree days after full bloom. We generally get to petal fall about 100 and 125 degree days after full bloom, but it's also possible that if we spray at 200 to 250 degree days and it doesn't work, we can come in later with this very late rescue thinning treatment between 300 and 350 degree days. Now I'd like to look at how it looks like right now in Clifton Park. I took the weather data from Clifton Park and ran it an hour ago to look at the carbohydrate model. And I present here on the top a graphic presentation of the carbohydrate balance since green tip. And you can see the green tip was in very early April. It was below zero, the balance, for the entire time, all the way up to about May 6th. And around May 6th, we had a few days of positive carbohydrate balance. And then since then, it's been slightly negative. And if you look at where we are today on the bottom part of this chart, today on May 20th, which is the green bar, our negative balance average for a 7-day period is minus 18. So that is this point right here. And it's predicted to go down slightly more negative to minus 29 over the next 2 days. That's as far as it will predict. We can see temperatures that are predicted all the way out to May 26th. And you can see that it's temperatures in the higher 70s, mid 70s, high 70s, lows in the 50s, meaning it's good because we don't have any really warm nights, and relatively bright sunshine. Above 20 is relatively bright. Below 20, we have, that day on the 23rd and on the 26th. And you'll see that that generally gives negative balances to the carbohydrate balance. That indicates that we're entering a phase when we should get a relatively good response from the thinners. We like to have a deficit of minus 20 to minus 30. And so when we have that kind of an average deficit, you'll see that the recommended thinning rate is the standard rate. And you see at the bottom that the green color means good thinning. If it's blue, it means you're going to get very mild thinning. You have to be very aware to not spray if it gets to have a red color. That's an extreme deficit, and you'll probably get natural thinning, and any chemical will over thin. Orange is sort of extremely good, and you got to be a little bit cautious. So if you run this every day, you can see at least what's predicted for your day and 2 days out on how much thinning you can expect just looking at the color of that coded bar. One last thing I want to point out on this carbohydrate balance is this last numeric column. This is the degree day accumulation. So I really didn't know exactly when to call full bloom in Clifton Park, so I think I put Monday or Sunday on there. But it shows that we've only accumulated up through today about 32 degree days. By May 26th, we'll be at the 100. So we're looking at what should be a petal fall somewhere between 100 and 125 degree days, like May 25th to May 26th. Now, many growers are accustomed to putting on an insecticide petal fall spray or a fungicide petal fall spray, and they call it the petal fall spray, but generally those are going on before we get enough degree days to really get good thinning. When we did an 18-year study, when we spray at the normal insecticide really early petal fall, when you can blow the petals off, which is generally be 50 and 70 degree days, we didn't get very good thinning. But if we waited till we got to around 100 degree days, then we got pretty decent thinning out of what we call the petal fall spray. So you can kind of run this model every day and see where you're at in degree days and try to look forward for a nice window to put on a petal fall spray. Now the petal fall spray, I should go back just to talk a little bit about what I'm suggesting, is either generally 7 alone or NAA and 7 or Amidthin and 7 or possibly Maxell and 7. I prefer NAA and 7 in a normal year. If, however, you had king flower damage that is greater than 40%, I do not want to see NAA in that petal fall spray. It would just be a petal fall spray of 7. So this again goes back to the necessity of evaluating every block and determining how much damage you have. But in a general way, I would love to NAA and 7. About 7.5 parts of NAA plus some 7 at petal fall is a very safe thinning. You can almost cover the whole farm. It'll be great for McCowan's, but it also helps things like Jonagold. It helps many, many varieties. The only exceptions are Red Delicious and Fuji, where NAA and then later Maxell tends to give pygmy fruit. So for those 2 varieties, we prefer Maxell and 7. So that spray is going to be coming up in a few days. But immediately after that spray goes on, I hope we'll get some people to measure fruitlet diameters and use the fruit growth rate model in the Capital District. This really helps me and helps all of us to know whether that petal fall spray worked and how well it worked and how many fruits are still on the tree. I know it's a pain in the neck, but I hope that we'll get at least 2 growers participating and measuring fruit diameter and sending me the data, which lets me help interpret it for you and give you advice for your particular orchard, but also give recommendations area-wide for the Capital District. Let me just summarize, and then I'd like to open it for questions. This is a year where you have to assess each block and each variety and take a numeric count of king flower damage. Generally, the assessments that have been done show much less lateral flower damage. Now, I was in a block in the Hudson Valley in Columbia County that had tremendous damage on both kings and laterals. But mostly I'm interested right now in the king flower damage. If it's greater than 40%, then you have to be really cautious. Either don't thin or thin with very low rates. Now, flower damage overall between kings and laterals is greater than 75%, you're just not going to thin this year. Basically, the frost has taken off all the extra flowers and you need all those that remain. Point number 2, I think this is a great time and a great year to use precision thinning with the caveat that we only are going to use blossom thinning where king damage is less than 40%. But almost everywhere we're going to come in with a petal fall spray except where damage is excessive. And then with measuring some fruitlet diameters, we can assess the response and determine after that petal fall spray exactly how many fruits we still have on the tree. In many blocks that have had damage, that's where we will stop. There will be no additional thinning needed. But in other blocks, we'll find out that we still have way too many fruits, and we'll then come back in about 12 millimeters, somewhere between 200 and 250 degree days, and spray again. And we'll have another meeting before then to give some suggestions. Then I hope we can get people to remeasure fruits after that spray to determine if we're finished or if we need to come in with a rescue spray between 18 and 20. 2 cautions this year. Where there's been frost damage, don't apply thinner to the bottom of the tree, bottom half of the tree. Generally, frost tend to have more damage in the bottom of the tree than in the top of the tree. Thus, the bottom of the tree will probably be thinned well enough with just a little bit of drift it receives from the spray to the top of the tree. Number 2, don't use surfactants this year, like regulator oil. I generally recommend surfactants with thinners because it really increases the response. However, some people have been using them despite me recommending against them, and they just sort of get used to it. But this year, with some damage to leaf cuticles and some damage to little fruitlets, the regulator, the oil, will cause excessive thinning. So with that, I'd like to open it for questions, and I'd be happy to answer any specific variety questions or thoughts that you might want to pose for me.
So there were a couple of questions posted in chat. Maurice Chugas asked if 80 flowers are open in regards to the thinning model starting time. If 80 flowers are open, but there's 0 bee activity, do they wait until they see the bees in trees to start the clock?
Yeah, you should wait. Generally, however, there's a lot of native pollinators out there that we don't see so much. I would wait a little while, but not too much. But I did want to comment, now that Mo reminds me of it, that where we do have some king damage, there's 2 possibilities. You have a little king damage, but you still want to blossom thin. What you can do is just wait a little while longer, let more kings open so that they can compensate for those that were damaged. Or you can just let the pollen tube model run longer. We know that if you let the pollen tube model run to 100% before you spray ATS, it doesn't thin that well in a really good year, but it might just be the right amount. So I've been talking with a good friend here in Western New York, Rod Farrow, and what he's going to do is just, instead of going 60% on the model, split it and go to 80% to compensate for a few flowers that were damaged.
All right. And then is it, another question, is it necessary to see phytotoxic damage to leaves for bloom thinner to have been considered effective?
With ATS, it is. If you spray ATS and your dose is wrong and you don't see any leaf margin burning, now what the damage we see is the very edges of the leaf get burned. And I like to see that to make sure that they had enough on. Wherever I have not seen any leaf margin burning, we don't ever get any thinning, and it's generally because they had too low of a rate. So our rates, let me just comment on that. Our rates in Western New York, where I've done most work with blossom thinning, are generally between 2 and 2.5% ATS. If you go up, as some in the West Coast do, to 4 and 5% ATS, we get, in a humid climate here, we get so much leaf phytotoxicity that it's scary. And therefore, I limit our maximum dose to 2.5. Now, on a good day like today, 2.5 would be just awesome. If it's a really, really hot day, I might just lower it down to 2%.
Okay. And then one last, it's a two-part question from Chris at Indian Ladder. In regards to Petal Fall Thinning Spray, they have a huge bloom in many varieties, but the kings are stunted and more or less the same size as laterals. % king damage, 10% lateral, 4 to 5 flowers per cluster. Should they treat this thinning situation as a kingless petal fall spray?
Well, that's a challenging situation. We really depend with thinning on having a king that's larger than the laterals. However, it's not the end of the world. With many varieties, we can still have a fabulous crop and good fruit size based upon a lateral flower when we lose them due to frost. I do think we still need to come in with a petal fall spray, because if that king is damaged, one of those laterals, and it's generally not the top lateral. If you look at the cluster, that they develop so that the lowest lateral develops first, then the second and the third. And the studies we did here with Martin Goffinet showed that the top two laterals are the least competitive. They give the smallest fruit. The bottom lateral is not that competitive, but it's lateral number 2 and 3 from the bottom, counting up, that generally can give good fruit size. And so when we spray a Petal Fall 7 spray, NAN 7 spray, I think it still, it seems to us, still picks those two flowers, one of those two flowers to remain, and knocks off the uppermost lateral and the lowermost lateral.
Okay, and then the second part is, how long does it take to see a bloom spray's effect before deciding on a petal fall spray?
So that's the real problem, that it's difficult to determine the blossom thinning results before you have to put on the petal fall spray. And that's one thing I wish I could solve. It generally is going to take about a week, but generally we have to spray that petal fall spray before then. But you can kind of get an idea when you look at each cluster, if the king is growing strongly at the petal fall timing and those laterals still are smallish, you probably had some good success and they'll be falling off. But often the base of that petal, the stem is not yet yellow. They don't fall off before we have to put on the petal fall spray. But I've often told people it's like playing the card game 21. You always take 2 cards. You always spray bloom and petal fall. Then you assess what you've got. The petal fall spray is a mild spray. It doesn't overthin. It never overthins. It never takes the king off. And if the lateral is already kind of weak and the bloom spray was partially knocking it off, the petal fall spray will just finish it off. So I don't think you have to worry too much about following the bloom spray with a petal fall spray.
Terence, quick question. In terms of the carbohydrate model, in the situation where you have a variety that has an extended bloom, maybe because of cool conditions, how do you choose the bloom start date?
We generally want to put that bloom date on the carbohydrate model with a very specific definition. I should write this down for people in the model right up somewhere, but it's when 80% of the flowers on the north side of the tree are open. So that's when you look at every cluster on the north side of the tree, and basically you got 4 out of 5 flowers open. Now, you may have some clusters with 0 open, but just on an average, when 4 out of 5 of all the flowers on the north side of the tree are open, that's the date of full bloom. And that's what we put in the model.
And Terence, do you have a suggested NAA rate for petal fall spray?
So if we're talking about Honeycrisp and or Fuji, we have tried everything, and low rates just don't cut it. I want to reemphasize, petal fall is a very safe time to spray because it doesn't work very well. So it's good and bad. But I really like to put that petal fall spray on because it helps us get started. So for Honeycrisp, we're suggesting 7.5 parts, which is 3 ounces per 100, plus a pint of 7. If we're putting NAA on at full bloom, we're suggesting a full 10 parts per million or 4 ounces per 100. We cut that back to 3 ounces per 100 for the petal fall spray of those varieties. Now I use the same thing on McCowan's, same thing on Jonagold, same thing on Empire. With Max and other easy to thin varieties, I cut it to 5 parts per million or 2 ounces per 100. But I never go below 2 ounces per 100 at petal fall just because it's not very strong thinner.
Terence, what about Cameo and Cortland?
So Cameo is one that we have a higher rate. So we put on the 7.5 parts or 3 ounces plus the 7. Cortland is different. Cortland is one that's a tip bearer, and so generally we don't need much 7. With just some NAA alone at 5 parts, we can generally do a pretty good job on Cortland.
We also had a few email questions come in. General thinning strategies for Evercrisp 1 and Crimson Crisp, Terence.
So with Evercrisp, I'm finding that it's a lot like Fuji, that we're not getting as good of return bloom in some cases after heavy crops. And then secondly, sometimes the set is kind of light. All my trees that I'm doing trials on are young. And so my opinion might change as I get older Evercrisp trees. I should have started earlier on it, but on my leave, I didn't have the trees at the right age. So they're all young and they're thinning quite easily for me. So in that case, 5 parts of NA or 2 ounces plus some 7 is doing a pretty good job. And then I'm measuring fruits and determining at 10 millimeter or 12 millimeter how much to spray. What was the other question? I forgot already.
The other variety was Crimson Crisp.
So Crimson Crisp is one that I like the 7.5 parts at petal fall plus 7. It's not extremely hard to thin, but it seems like I've gotten pretty good results with that petal fall spray. And sometimes I've gotten away with just that spray, but this is another one where I have to see whether the petal fall spray works or it doesn't. I'll just add that over the years, petal fall sprays sometimes work really well. In the big, long 18-year study we did, I think there was 3 years when that was all the spray that was needed. But all the other years, it was very, very mild. So it just really depends on what kind of temperatures we get after the petal fall spray, to how well it's going to work.
Terence, 7 rate, well, would you go 1 pint, 1.5 pint?
So I generally recommend 1 pint. Now this is a big not controversy. I debate it all the time with consultants that like 2 pints, and the 2 pints is not really soluble. So that extra pint is just deposited on the leaf. If you get re-wetting, it's a good additional thinning. So on hard to thin years, people like that extra pint sitting on the leaf so they get a little dew and a little bit of rain and you get more thinning. This year, however, with frost damage, I think it's playing with dynamite. So I would hope nobody puts in more than a pint because I don't want any extra 7 sitting on the leaf surface to get re-wetted and give us more thinning than what we wanted.
Terence, any recommendations for organic thinning? Is lime sulfur their only option, or do they have anything else that they can be working with?
There is a second product. Let me comment about organic. We do have a big organic block here in Geneva, and I have to thin it. And unfortunately, the best approach is lime sulfur and oil. but it's not technically legal. And so I cannot recommend it. The other product, well, yeah, our test where we spray it is 2.5% lime sulfur and 2% oil. So 2.5 and 2. And it's worked quite well, especially when they use a pollen tube growth model and we're putting on 2 sprays. But until we get a company willing to register lime sulfur during bloom, we can't recommend it. So the only other option that's legal is Regalia. It's a plant extract and it's a product that is registered and we can use it. However, we have, I don't know how to put it in, with the best words. It's been very, very mild and very disappointing in the amount of thinning we get. So it's available, and if you use it right with a pollen tube growth model and get lucky, it probably will do some thinning, but it seems to be very, very mild for us. ATS is not legal in organic orchards.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Terence? If so, please enter them into the chat box. But otherwise, I'm going to thank Terence and turn it over to Peter Jentsch. One more quick question.
Yeah. For easy to thin varieties in blocks without 7, what rate of maxil would you choose?
So I have to distinguish between whether it's a petal fall spray at around 100 to 125 degree days versus the big spray at 200 to 250 degree days, which is the 12 millimeter spray. If it's a petal fall spray, the amount of maxel I generally like is somewhere around 100. No, we're talking about easy to thin varieties. It's 75 parts per million. But when we get to the normal 10 millimeter stage, I cut that on easy to thin varieties to only 50 parts per million. So 50 parts per million, if I've got to remember, I got the tables in the recommends. You'll have to look up how many ounces that translates to, because I can't remember it right now and don't want to misstate it. For hard to thin varieties, it's always 100 parts per million. Good luck, everybody.
All right, great. Thank you, Terence. So with that, I'm going to invite Peter Jentsch to share his screen and talk about insect management.
Thanks, Mike. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming on board this beautiful afternoon. It's hard to get out of the field on days like this. So I'll try to move through what I have for everyone. And there's 2 screens up, if you will. I'll move through the PowerPoint first. Just try to touch on some basic points. So you guys are in for what looks to be really good weather over the next few days. Low to moderate wind conditions in the evenings, early mornings look really good for spraying. And then you're moving into some pretty high temperatures. We didn't have that at all during our bloom period. We had a very extended bloom period. And as was made mention, it was really all over the map. We had flowers that were open that were being pollinated, and we had flowers that were still well and pink. This was a little over a week ago. And so some of the injury that we had by cutting into those early developing pink stage flowers, the kings, especially some flower injury with browning in the very center of those cuts. And it's straightforward. You can pinch them with your fingernail, or you can take a nice clean knife to get both longitudinal and latitudinal cuts to see what kind of injury you're seeing. When you put them under a scope, it becomes much more evident. But as was made mention by Dan earlier in conversation, as well as Terence, in some places, and this is on the hill here at the Hudson Valley Research Lab, even though we saw quite a bit of this injury, our crop is looking fairly well. And we'll see what our thinning does over the next week or 2. With regards to bees, I just want to touch on some aspects of the use of pesticides in and around honeybees, bees that are brought in, and the native pollinators. So you can see here at low temperatures, in the low 50s or upper 40s, very few of the bees are actually out foraging. And as you move closer to 65, which is really the mark we're shooting for with regards to getting everybody out that's going to forage, is at that 65-degree mark. So when we talk about bees foraging, usually half the hive will be out foraging. Of that half, a quarter of them will be foraging for pollen, and the other half will be foraging for nectar. So really the bees that are foraging for pollen are the ones that are helping us pollinate. And generally the use of pesticides, really fungicides and insecticides both can cause bee decline. It can reduce foraging, cause some strange behavior, poor brood development, and a queenless hive when they begin to really reproduce. So if you have bees brought in by beekeepers, you really need to take that into consideration. There are certain classes of insecticides that can be applied to flowers that are actually in bloom, but we'd like to try to, as best as we can, be able to assess the situation more times than not. Even if you didn't have a pink application on this season, moving into bloom, very relatively low levels of insect activity that we've seen this season. However, for you in the Albany area, with the warm temperatures moving up, it's likely that you're going to see much more activity from the pest complex. So we turned the corner about 5 days ago, where we started seeing temperatures that moved from high 30s, 40s at night into the 50s at night, and then temperatures reaching up into the 70s during the day. And all of a sudden, oblique-banded leaf roller starts showing up, and we begin to see some feeding on the growing stems. And most recently, over the last 2 days, we're starting to see feeding on the fruit itself. And so a lot of that is lepidopteran activity, and the majority of that, at least from what we're seeing, is from oblique-banded leaf roller. So in insecticides in class 4, these are ingredients in the actives that are not hazardous to honeybees at any time during the bloom period. And so they don't carry application constraints during bloom. However, it's really important to understand that if you're simply using an insecticide in a safe class, if you mix almost anything with it, there's a chance of just skyrocketing the toxicity to pollinators. So with that, any interaction and synergy with adjuvants and fungicides need to be taken into consideration during the process if you're going to apply anything during bloom. Now, there's been a lot of work recently done on adjuvants and fungicides, and I'll provide a link and also provide anyone with that particular slide as we move forward. So a really good example is the use of pipernyl butoxide. Now, it might be something that you've never heard of before. It's called PBO. If you were to ask somebody for that material at a distributor. So this material inhibits the detoxification by the insect of the insecticide, right? So some of the pyrethrins, the organic materials, have PBO in it, and if it's a part of the mix, then PBO is going to affect insect toxicity. So even though you consider pyrethrins and organic materials as having relatively low toxicity, once you add PBO, all bets are off, and you dramatically increase the toxicity, especially to honeybees. So that said, there's 2 references here with regards to pesticide decision-making. One is out of Cornell, Scott McArt's lab, and the other is out of Washington State. And both of them discuss the pros and cons of insecticide use. And I can put those up for you as needed later on. Here's the number of insecticides in class 4 that are not hazardous to bees at any time. So there's a number of them now, such as Altacor, that would be ideal for the LEP complex. I would reserve that material for oblique-banded leaf roller. I would not be using that during bloom because there's other options, one of which is Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT. It's ideal for surface feeding LEPs like the leaf roller complex, and if I was going to use something during bloom, I'd use BT products. If you apply them under low light conditions, that is cloudy skies, cooler temperatures, they tend to last a little bit longer. The other insect that has caused considerable damage in the Hudson Valley in a lot of our blocks, especially those that have broadleaf weeds that are problematic is tarnished plant bug, and the use of Belief or flunicamide is something that you can consider. Esteem for use against San Jose scale could be delayed until later on, and with regards to mites, also a timely petal fall spray for them would be ideal. So there are another group of insecticides that I'll just state are in a class called class 3. They're not harmful to bees if they're applied late in the evening when the bees are not flying, or early in the morning when the bees are not out. So temperatures below 50 degrees are idyllic. Now, if it's high temperature, obviously the bees are going to be out and about, and you want something that's going to have fast drying time if you're applying it at night. So these constraints should really be applied to any of these other materials such as the Sail and Avant. And I picked those out because those materials would likely be used if plum curculio became really problematic on king fruitlets during the bloom period. Avant is a material that's very toxic to bees when applied directly. However, if they're applied so that it can dry before the bees are foraging, then the label would allow for that. Again, I just would like to add to use extreme caution when making these decisions, because your beekeeper is your friend and you want to make sure you keep them happy. So here's the label on Avant. Basically, it states that the product is highly toxic to bees exposed to direct treatment on blooming crops or weeds. Do not apply this product directly or allow it to drift to blooming crops while bees are foraging in the treatment area. So that's absolutely critical with both Avant and the Sail. Okay, emerging pests that we're seeing this week in the Hudson Valley. Black stem borer, Mike has worked with this quite a bit, as has Dan. They are in the group of coleopteran called ambrosia beetle. They can be trapped using ethanol traps. Here's a lid of our ethanol trap. I used that screen to pour the soap solution through. The ethanol is in a trap container, and so you can see that they're very small. This is the lid of a deli container, and as you blow them up, you can see the size of this thing. For a very small insect, they cause a tremendous amount of injury. They can cause trees to go into decline in the first year of infestation and cause trees to collapse in the end of the first year into the second year. So this week, we've seen dozens of trees in the Milton Marlborough area succumb to black stem borer, predominantly because the trees were planted on very shale soil, so not a lot of holding capacity when it comes to water, and it's likely that last year they went through a period when stem borer were out in spring of drought, and so without irrigation on those trees, they succumbed to black stem borer. And here's some of the images that we're looking at. You can see the trees beyond the one we're looking at here. You can see they're fairly robust. A lot of them have foliage beyond these rows, but this is the knoll of the hill, and these trees are going into decline. You can see the bleeding sites there on the trunk, the lower part of the trunk, all the way down to the graft union, bleeding sites that are indication of wounds in the trunk. When we begin to cut into these wounds, you can see that small black dot there that indicates burrowing into the trunk. And in some of the trees, there's galleries behind that. So that ooze is something you should be looking for over the next few weeks. Now, these are infestations from a previous year, so these wounds do not have any live larvae or adults in them. They're from the previous year. So moving on to plum curculio, we have found a few of these over the last week in our black stem borer traps. However, after scouting today along the edge of ginger gold, a variety that's extremely vulnerable. We're well over 7 millimeters at this point. In some of the kings, we're up closer to 10 or 11. And as of yet, we have not seen any ovipositional sites or feeding scars from plum curculio. But that's something that the North Country's got to look out for, given the warm temperatures we're going to see over the next few days. Codling moth began to fly here in Highland, and we had a sustained flight over the weekend. So with codling moth, using the NUA model to be able to determine when it's time to make applications for codling moth would be a really helpful tool. If you haven't used that before, play around with the NUA site, dig into the Apple insect models, and it will really help you determine when to put those first applications on for calling moth. So if you plan on using insect growth regulators such as Ryman, it's an excellent material, but you want to apply that shortly after the first flight. As they lay eggs, laying those eggs on the residue of the Ryman is really critical for that insecticide to be effective. If we're just looking conventionally at some of the materials that we have, it seems like at least in the Hudson Valley, calling moth is turning up in more and more packing lines more frequently. So we're having a problem with controlling calling moth using conventional insecticides like pyrethroids or the organophosphate imidam. Nonetheless, in many places it seems to be working, in other places it seems to be falling down. The use of Altacor, which is of course a pricier material if you're going to mix it with something like imidam for plum curculio control. Altacor does not have curculio control. It's likely you wouldn't need it until about first cover, so 10 to 14 days after petal fall for calling moth. We've been using delegate or materials in the same class like Spintor, Spinosad, and so on for quite some time. And it may be that we're seeing some level of, I wouldn't use the word resistance quite yet, but loss of susceptibility to those insecticides. We have a really nice material that's very plum curculio active called Exaril. That might be an option. A sail we like to use later in the season for apple maggot and maybe second generation calling moth, but that's an option now. Besiege is a combination, as is Volium flexi, that includes chlorantraniliprole, which is the active in Altacor. And then, of course, there's mating disruption, which is a strong consideration for folks growing organically, and then entrust. So with that, a lot of guys are planting trees. You know, we're in the middle of bloom. There's a lot going on, but I would like to sort of bring your attention to, I don't think you can see anything other than this screen, right, Mike?
Just this screen at the moment, Peter.
Yeah, okay, well, just going to make mention that the use of Lorsban for black stem borer is still available, but we've had some growers that have used it mid to late season to control black stem borer or even dogwood borer, and I would recommend against the use of Lorsban later in the season because the volatility and the residual of that can be picked up at harvest, and you certainly don't want to lose markets over that. So if you're going to make applications for black stem borer and you're beginning to see those feeding sites, then chloropyrifos is an excellent material to use. It's got long residual. So I think, Mike, I'm probably out of time. If anyone has a question, you can shoot it over via chat, or if I have a minute, I'll take one or two.
Yeah, there was 2 questions in chat. Jeff Klein asked if PBOs were banned for organic in regards to the PBO and bees discussion.
I'm not sure of the status of PBO in organic. I know that I have recently seen it on the label in materials that are available in places like Home Depot or Lowe's, but I really don't know if they have banned that from the organic production mission. I imagine that's the direction they're taking. So these materials that do have PBO in them are probably not for use in organic production.
Okay. And then the other question was, are tarnished plant bug or European apple sawfly ahead of plum curculio?
So European apple sawfly would be ahead of curculio, and they lay their eggs on the developing flowers. Once the eggs hatch, they begin to burrow. Well, they surface feed for a period of time, and then they burrow into the fruit. A timely petal fall spray, and by that, I'm thinking that 80% petal fall of, let's say, Macintosh. The flowers are pretty much dried out and not that attractive to bees, and that's sort of the standard petal fall timing. That would pick up European apple sawfly. The problem that we run into sometimes is that if you don't have a pink spray on, you have prolonged bloom and the beekeeper is delayed for some reason taking the bees out. That's when we run into problems with European apple sawfly. With plant bug, they can be in the crop feeding during bloom. A lot of their damage can be done even pre-bloom during the tight cluster to pink period. And yet, given the cold temperatures, I have not seen any plant bug to speak of, nor have we seen any European apple sawfly to date. That's going to change over the next few days, and in the North Country, all that can change pretty quickly. Well, thank you for your attention and your time and your questions.
All right, great. It doesn't seem there's any more questions right now, Peter, but we'll let you know if any more do pop up.
All
So
right,
at this
Mike.
point, I'll introduce Srdjan Acimovic, and he'll discuss disease management.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go and share my screen right now.
No, that's not it.
Okay, this is me. Okay, good. So this has been a challenging year, not only from the point of view of the frosts we had in the Hudson Valley and the capital region, but it also has been a challenge by the amount of rain that we have received, and actually the frequency of rain that we had during the week, from week after week after week up until maybe in a recent week and a half that we got a little bit drier. So we have observed first apple scab symptoms around the 11th May. So right about at this time, you know, if there was any mistakes and missouts with spraying fungicides for scab, it should be obvious by this time if that happened or not. So on this chart on the that you see on this table that I've pasted in here, I you know, just highlighted the key infection events that roughly, if we would eyeball, you know, the whole valley, these were the three major infection periods that happened, you know, so far, with the April 30th being the one that was ubiquitously present in all the Hudson Valley, and it was the major infection period that happened. And then on the left side, next to these red rectangles, you see the percentages of the ascospores that were released on those days. And what I wished to just show you here is that regardless of whether you have less than 1% on March 28th, or you have up about like 16% of ascospores on April 30th, yes, there is a difference also between these numbers, but you can definitely have scab problems if the infection happens with even less than 1% ascospores. So the symptoms that we see on May 11th are most likely the result of the infection that happened on March 28th. So, and I know because we basically have an unsprayed block in which we monitor 3 apple cultivars, and right about the same time for Jersey Mac and for Golden Delicious and for the Cortland, we have seen symptoms show up about 11th May. And so basically, I have a lot of people asking me whether, you know, the inoculum is, you know, still, because the weather is cold, whether, you know, that's not enough for the scab to establish the infection. And they look at the ascospore numbers or percentages that are reported. But, you know, you can still have severe issues even with less than 1% ascospores being released. So this is the way how the new output looked like. And you have seen these multiple other infection events that are between these red rectangles, okay, that I just mentioned to you that were the major scab infection periods. So that's something that, you know, these other ones that are around these rectangles are just not the ones that you would need to have the fungicide coverage for, because they were not major infection periods. And we know that because we use the RimPro apple scab model, which gives us the ability to know which of those ascospore releases have actually caused the infection. So if you look at here, this is in New Paltz. I've just put it out as a sample for you. In this blue rectangle or square that I've highlighted this for you, you see that infection that happened on the 28th of March, and it got just above the line that is here dashed as a medium infection risk. And so this would be an infection that we would say that growers who had issues with scab last year in this orchard, they would have to go out and protect against this infection. So all the other commercial growers that did not have scab last year, so there's no infection pressure, they would be fine in skipping this fungicide spray all the way up until the point of 26th April. So almost up until the pink. So so basically this whole period with all these big white humps that you see here were just ascospore releases that did not, pan out to be an infection because the conditions for germinating ascospores were not proper for them to cause the to allow them to actually continue the infection and establish the infection on the leaves because it was too cold. So that's the major advantage of Rimpro over the newer model, because it gives you the ability to know how severe the infection first is going to be. And that's the example here that I'm giving you with 28th March, where, if you had scab clean orchard, you didn't have to cover for this time right about between green tip and half-inch green. And then you would continue not needing a spray all the way up until, I would say, right about the just before early pink, I would say. So which would be your 27th or 27th April. So you would save a lot of money by basically not applying fungicides up until that point, because there's just not enough conducive conditions for the germinating ascospores to finish the infection. So, and you see here that on the 27th of April, this infection that is here as a red line that is visible here in this below this white hump, that's another medium infection risk, shows severity that does not call for a fungicide protection, in the case of all the orchards that did not have scab show up in their orchards last year. But right after that, we had 30th April major scab infection that went all the way up to rim value of 600. And this was a big, severe infection that would require a fungicide spray for almost all locations, because at that time, you basically have 6% of ascospores released, and those 6%, or actually there's more percentage of them released, but 6% of those released actually have caused the infection at that time. So that was the first major infection scab period that all the commercial orchards had to spray that did not have scab last year. And then from that point on, from pink to petal fall, you would have to maintain your coverage in a 5 to 7 day schedule, because the leaf expansion is another factor that dilutes the residue on the leaves, not only the amount of rain that you get as well. So the other piece of information that I wish you to bring from this slide is that not only that you can save money with using this model, and I know that it's tricky we have 24 farms that are working with the Hudson Valley plant pathology program to use this model across Eastern New York, including Long Island. So we have another key piece of information in this model. So it is a little bit difficult to use it because the weather forecasts are not as stable beyond, I would say, 48 hours. But in general, knowing that the conditions are cool, many times these infections that might seem are going to pan out eventually end up being not infections, and then you don't need fungicide spray. So I have people who, among those 24 farms, who come and tell me, I'm going to wait to see if this is going to be an infection or not, and then come back after that. And there's some growers that did not do that up until 30th April. I'm sorry. So the other piece of information is this chart that you see just below the main central screen with scab infections. That this is actually the maturation of the ascospores, where the dark red is the amount of the immature spores that are still residing in the leaves, and the light red right above it is the amount of the mature ascospores that still are remaining to be released as well. And so what is important with me bringing this second graph to you is that you realize that this maturation model in Rimpro is much more accurate than the maturation model that NUA has inside and shows you, where, if you looked at that model right now, the primary scab season is over in that model. Okay, and that's actually not true. And we know that because I monitor the scab ascospore release at the beginning, so that you can type in the biofix date. And in this specific case for new pulse, you see that biofix date here on the left side is 17th March. And that allows to recalibrate the model so that it functions properly in terms of the maturation of the spores. And we are not at this point yet at the end of the primary scab season, meaning we're not at the point when the ascospore load in the leaves goes below 5%. We're still right about, I would say, 8 to 9 to 15%, depending on location. So if you say go from Red Hook to Bennington, Vermont, or Altamont, New York, you would have a range between 8 to 17% ascospores still remaining to be released. So the primary scab season is not over yet. Okay, and even then, when I post a blog that primary scab season is over, notifying you that the ascospore load in the leaves went below 5%. Okay, even then you have to continue your fungicide sprays for 2 weeks after that, because you don't know how well your coverage was, and you don't know whether there was maybe some issues with wind at that time, and maybe some fungicides did not hit every surface, every part of the surface of the leaves, and you don't want to have those issues. You have to continue that fungicide sprays up to 2 weeks after the date that I call as a primary scab season ends. So we're still right at the tail end of that, and we're waiting for that to happen. So one thing that is interesting is that in Highland, we did not see the symptoms of rust at the same time as development of the symptoms of scab. Just today, we have seen the first symptoms of rust. And on the 11th May, we have seen the first symptoms of scab. So there's some difference. It seems that the cold weather that persisted over this time did not really favor these infections by rust. And right about this time, we're seeing first infections of rust. And the blog is going to come out tonight about that, at least for the lower Hudson Valley. So in general, 2 frequent rain events. So if you see this graph here that I just picked for you, in this purple rectangle down there, you see these small blue curved lines above these dates that show you, in basically how many days we had rain happen up until 13th of May. So it was a very similar year in the amount of rain and frequency to 2017. So this is the year when you know that your investment in fungicides pays off. Okay, and specifically in this case, it also using Rimpro is going to pay off to you as well, because the conditions like temperature that affect apple scab fungus severely, inability to cause the infection would save you money as well on fungicides. So in general, you see how the temperatures looked like we were, quite below the averages that we would expect for these months. So I expect to see some fungal issues, but hopefully, if people have kept their sprays tight from pink to petal full, it will be good. And we're not going to see any symptoms. So if I would just summarize my take-home messages, that our monitoring has showed of scab ascospores, we showed that the biofix was much earlier than usual. It really spanned anywhere from 16th to 30th March that we detected the first ascospores, and this aligns pretty well with what people at Penn State also reported to us. We have seen that the mild winter probably contributed to faster maturation of the ascospores in the leaf litter. We did not have severe infections before 30th April. On 30th April, we got one. So there was a time you could save fungicides up until this 30th April. We have seen first symptoms on 11th May, and I expect that right about this time, if any problems with scab arise, they're going to start showing up right about this time. And in the capital region, there's infections that when I was writing this blog were happening on May 15th and 17th. But right about now, we're going to have an infection of scab coming on the 23rd May. I looked at the model this morning, and there's going to be some rain potentially coming in capital region on the 23rd May. So definitely continue doing your fungicides. And what is important is that, if you think that it's good for your operation, I would highly recommend you use Rimpro. And, we basically believe that there's double benefit of using the model because of the maturation of the spores, monitoring along with the infections and how severe the infections are. And Rimpro is definitely more accurate in predicting how much ascospores you have left. And these are the percentages here. Between 9 to 18% of the ascospores are still remaining in the leaf litter. So we just don't have yet the date when we can say that there's going to be 5% ascospores less than that, remaining in the leaf. So, I'm going to report about that, timely. In general, if we look at the weather, how it looked like in terms of fire blight, we did not have conducive conditions up until the week of May 16th into May 19th. So the EIP value, because the cool weather did not ramp up to 100 up until we came to the point right about this week of May 17th. So I'm just gonna go and pull out one graph for you to see. So this is from today. I'm just gonna go and show you how the risks look like for the next week. So I'm looking at these models, and we're gonna switch into a higher risk potential for fire-blood infection on May 22nd or May 23rd. So we are expecting the first major infection potentially could happen about that time if the rain occurs on top of when we have the EIP value above 100. And some locations, you can see here, like Claverack, okay, has an infection announced on the rain showers that are going to happen on May 23rd. So keep an eye on your EIP model in NUA, which is the closest you can get to mare blight that you had to previously install on your computer. So there's a potential for infection if you get rain on May 23rd. And since you are still in bloom in those locations, keep an eye on those models. And so in the Hudson Valley, we already passed through this infection period between May 17th and 19th. You guys did not go through that, but now we're getting into a very warm weather ahead of us and potential infection on May 23rd. And that the weather forecast changes relatively, even on a scale less than 48 hours. So when I published my blog yesterday, today I see that infections are potentially possible in these locations that I just mentioned to you, like Claverack, Bennington, Vermont, and potentially other locations there like Red Hook as well could get an infection on May 23rd. So we are entering that period of high infection potential, meaning that the pathogen is able to grow its populations on flowers to a level that if it gets rain, it's going to cause the infection. So just keep an eye open, and then every day look at the NUA model so that you can see whether that infection is going to happen on May 23rd or not. So in general, I know that some of you are looking at the RimPro Fireblight model. I, at this time, am more confident in the NUA's EIP model, which is closest to Mareblight that you can access for free. The model in RimPro for Fireblight, which I'm showing here in this graph, is a little bit newer, needs more fine-tuning, I guess. And in these cases, I would trust more the other model. But I just wanted to show you here that in Claverack, there was apparently infection reported on May 9th, whereas we are convinced that that was not the case based on the NUA model. Okay, and the reason most likely why this infection was reported in Claverack is because of the frost that happened on May 9th. And there is some data to show that frost can allow the pathogen to infect on flowers. So with this, I would just close my expose and just to open it for questions for you guys.
All right, great. Thank you, Srdjan. I don't see any in the chat box right now, but if anybody does have questions for him, please continue typing those in. And then in the meantime, we'll let Donahue Acimovic share her screen and start her presentation on fruit quality management and sunburn management. All right, thank you, Srdjan.
Hi, Mike. Hello, everyone. So I'll just, okay, I need to, all right. So yeah, I'll present the management for the sunburn damages in apple. Maybe most of you already know that sunburn is a psychological disorder caused by excessive solar radiation and high air temperature during the ripening period. And in apples, we see three types of the sunburn disorders, which is sunburn browning, necrosis, and photooxidative sunburn damages. And their occurrence depends on the level of which the level of the air temperature and the solar radiation the fruits are exposed to. So if the temperature is above 86 Fahrenheit and fruits are fully exposed to the sun, all requirements for sunburn incidence are fulfilled. So in our 5-year study, we see that sunburn damage could be from 10 to 40% of all affected fruits. And during those 5 years, we only have 1 year, which is 2017, that we didn't see any sunburn damages. So I'm now gonna show you the graph, how our average year looks like. And that was 2019, during which we had 20 days where the maximum temperature was above 86 Fahrenheit or 31 Celsius degree. And during that year, we had approximately 10 to 15% of the sunburn incidence on fruits, and the level just depends on the varieties. On the other hand, we had another extreme, which happened in 2016, and during that year we had almost 40 days where the temperature was above 86 Fahrenheit, and the incidence was 40% of fruit was affected with this disorder. During the last 5 years, we okay, this time. During the last 5 years, we checked many different strategies. So we tested over the row nettings. We also tested over the tree nets, drape nets trial, and we had overhead irrigation. We also had a couple of different spray products, and most of them, like Crochet, Screen Duo, or Surround, are making a white particle films on the fruit surface, which will reflect solar radiation and make the fruit surface temperature lower. Something similar happened also with overhead irrigation. Water evaporates and cools down the fruit surface temperature. Nets would act in the way that they just reflect solar radiation and in that way keeps the fruit surface temperature low. We also have one product, Rainox, that is based on the wax-like materials, and those materials can are actually augment the natural waxes in the fruit cuticle and ameliorate the damage caused by UV or infrared radiation. So here, the next slide, you'll see the table with all our treatments that we tested. Their active ingredients, the rates we applied, and timing we applied those treatments. There's no perfect solution for the sunburn. Each of those treatments have its pros and cons. For example, we get excellent sunburn protection using over-the-row netting and drape nets, especially in the black color. However, those treatments would affect development, color development on the fruit. Also would impact, also would affect sugar accumulation, and in some extreme cases would reduce yield. We had good effect applying Rainox. We had similar effect with evaporative cooling, and also Surround and Crochet would reduce sunburn incidence and wouldn't interfere with the fruit quality. Screen Duo didn't really show very well in this trial. So one more thing I want to add about Surround and Crochet, although they work very well, they just make that white particle film over the fruit surface, which would you need to just wash it before you send your fruits to the market, and sometimes that material can cause allergies in workers who would come into the direct contact with the fruit. So now I'm going to switch to drape net trial. In this trial, we use white color of the nets, which is recommended for our region. Since this nets are used not only for sunburn protection, but also for hail protection, for pest and insect protection, we tested it on 6 different varieties. You can see how each of the varieties look like in comparison to the untreated control. So we had in our trial Empire Gala, Honeycrisp, New York 1, 2, and Fuji. In this graph, you'll see how each of those varieties responded to our trial. And I would group all varieties into 2 categories, one that responded really well to white drape net, and the other one that really didn't respond well. So among all parameters that we tested, such as yield, fruit weight, fruit firmness, sugar, acid, color, and of course sunburn incidence. You can see from the table that Gala, New York 1, New York 2, and Fuji really didn't respond well to white drape nets. It's just that under those nets, this variety couldn't either develop color and couldn't reach the sugar level at the harvest time. In some cases, like with Gala, we really had a huge yield reduction. On the other hand, you can see Honeycrisp, New York 2, and Empire responded relatively good to white nets. Some parameters even improved with the white nets, such as in New York 1, where we had improvement of the color development. So with that, I would finish my presentation and take any further question.
Great, thank you, Donna. Does anybody have any questions for Donna? If so, please type them into the chat box, but otherwise, thank you again. And next up, we are going to hear from Dan Donahue, my counterpart in the Hudson Valley, and he's going to talk a little bit about bitter pit prevention.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, let's just do a review. You know, if we were having this conversation, maybe even 5 years ago, but certainly 10, we'd be starting to talk about, well, this coming season, how are you going to reduce your bitter pit? We'd be talking about calcium sprays in the summer. But actually, things have gotten more complicated and I think more effective in terms of our bitter pit reduction programs. And we've taken a more integrated approach, let's say, that is really almost year-round in the actions that we take. So right now, we're actually in the midpoint of our mitigation program. But let's start from the very beginning. Pre-plant, we know that rootstock selection is an important factor. We won't get into details on this at this point, but we've talked about it at fruit schools in the past. Also, your pre-plant preparation. Lai-Ling Cheng recommends, pH of 6.8 at least in your Honeycrisp blocks. Terence Robinson just recently mentioned at our pruning demonstration back in the Valley on March 12th that he has data to show that maintaining a pH of around 7 in your Honeycrisp blocks helps mitigate bitter pit. So again, a good strategy to follow. Looking at mineral nutrition a little more deeply now, we've understood for a number of years that high nitrogen rates are not our friend with Honeycrisp, and they can aggravate bitter pit situations. It's my observation in the Hudson Valley and really Eastern New York that we've gotten this message. I think our growers of Honeycrisp have understood this and have really cut back on their nitrogen fertilization. I know from our 3-year survey study, an average terminal shoot extension of about 11 inches a year. So that's pretty moderate. So we've gotten the message on that one. More recently, Lai-Ling Cheng and Mario Morandasazzo have done a lot of work looking at potassium and come to the conclusion that we may be over-fertilizing with potassium, and we need to look at moderating those applications as well. So that brings us up now to where we are at this point. We do know that when Honeycrisp, being strongly biennial, in a light year, you get a lot of bitter pit. In a heavy crop year, you get less bitter pit. And for a lot of reasons, we would like to maintain, a stable crop load and solid annual cropping. That too would help us manage bitter pit. The other thing we've learned in recent years is for some reason, the use of apogee in a single application at pink helps, with a suppression of around 50%. And we're past that point now, but I know many of you have made that application. So that takes us to where we are right now. What's the next step? Traditionally, the next step is applying foliar or exogenous calcium sprays. When do we start those sprays? Well, traditionally, it's been in the summertime. But what we've learned in recent years is that starting earlier is better. And research conducted in the Valley has shown that foliar calcium applied certainly during the cell mitosis period, so petal fall fruit set on for about 42, 45 days afterwards, is really a great time to be applying calcium. We have data to show that calcium deficiencies in fruitlets occur really, really early in the season. So taking steps early to have calcium available is a good thing. Calcium does not like to move into the plant tissue, and it doesn't like to move once it's in the plant tissue. So really the calcium cations have to be really locally available to be of use. So how am I going to phrase this? If in your budget you have money for 5 foliar calcium applications this season, I would time the first for petal fall and apply them weekly until you've made your 5 applications. That would cover the cell mitosis period. If you want to spend more money on calcium, then add some summer sprays. You stretch your interval out to 10 to 14 days, until you've spent as much money as you'd like to spend, I guess. There's some growers are spraying even earlier than petal fall, bloom, pink. I don't have any data on that. I don't see a reason why not, other than keep in mind that most foliar calciums are not compatible with apogee or kudos in the tank. The exception is a product called Agri-K that studies have shown that it's okay to tank mix that one with apogee or kudos. Okay, so with that then, you've done everything, you've taken every step that you possibly can to reduce bitter pit, and I'm sorry, but you're still going to have bitter pit. It'll help, but it's not going to completely eliminate the problem. So the next management strategy is essentially avoidance, and that is take advantage that we know that there's a lot of variability in bitter pit incidence from year to year, from block to block. But you can't always be assured that a given block is going to be reliably, say, free of bitter pit. In our 3-year study with 36 orchards we observed very, very closely, only 4 of those orchards were reliably clean, say less than 5% bitter pit on an annual basis, when our regional average is usually between somewhere around 20%, sometimes even higher than that. The rest of the blocks may have been clean one year, but then high the next. So we want to be able to predict bitter pit incidence. We want to be able to predict the incidence of fruit that has been in storage for a period of time. We want to be able to make a decision, and if you have, say, 3 Honeycrisp blocks, that block 1 is going to be clean of bitter pit this year, so it's safe to put into storage. Block 2, have a little bit of bitter pit, but maybe it's okay, I'll put that in storage. Block 3, the prediction is 40% bitter pit incidence, and no way you want to put that into storage. So you would want to market that fruit more quickly in the season. to avoid that additional development of bitter pit in storage. Of course, there's a caveat to that, which if Chris Watkins were listening to this call, he would very quickly remind me that, wow, so you have a block with 40, 50% bitter pit potential. Is it a good idea to market that, put that fruit into the retail channel? What happens if it's clean leaving the packing house, say in Hudson Valley on October 2nd, but it sits in the retail channel for 10 days under maybe no refrigeration, and bitter pit develops in transit and the consumer will react negatively? So that's a very, very valid point for high bitter pit blocks. But that being said, can we predict bitter pit, a block, how much bitter pit you will see in storage? So we have a current farm viability project in play. This will be the second year. And the project has a couple of components. One is the continued development of the Eastern New York model. We call it EMR, for environment, mineral, and rootstock being the major factors that figure into the model. It's more sophisticated than simply peel mineral testing. And then there's a prediction protocol that called the passive, which was developed by Chris Watkins and Yosef Al-Shaf. That's a pretty simple process. You pick 120 apples randomly in an orchard block 3 weeks before harvest, and you have those in bushel crates, and you have them sit in the office at room temperature for 3 weeks. The day before you plan to harvest, you sit down and you go through those 120 apples and you score them clean or bitter pit, come up with a percentage of bitter pit incidence, add 6 to it, and that's your prediction for bitter pit out of several months of storage. It takes a lot of labor, but there's no additional cost to do that. Our protocol involves doing peel sampling of the calyx end of the apple, 12 apples out of a block. In the Hudson Valley, it's 5 weeks before harvest. In the Hudson Valley, that's around August 1st. So it's later, 2 weeks later in the Champlain Valley and somewhere in the middle out in Western New York. You use Grandma's Norpro apple peeler. You attach it to the kitchen counter, and you just you peel the apple like you were going to make a pie. You use the calyx end of the sample, and then we send it off to Cornell. And we do 2 types of analysis at this point. One is a digestive wood ash analysis, and the other is a water extraction analysis, or sometimes called SAP analysis. We're working with both methods at this point. The concept is to take a sample 5 weeks ahead of harvest. This allows a couple of weeks processing time, plug the results into a model, and it'll give us a predicted bitter pit incidence. So the project involves development work on those, plus more importantly, validation work. So I want to make a point about model development here. You can develop equations, mathematics to describe what happens in a data set. And that's what we're doing with the development data set in Eastern New York. However, you need to be able to validate that model on an independent data set. That is data that was not used to develop the model. And we're doing that around the state. We have 80 blocks distributed in the 3 main growing regions where we pull samples, very commercially oriented. And in addition to giving a prediction for that block, we pull a validation sample out of that block at harvest, and we put it away in storage. And then we check to see how accurate the model predicted. So that's the process. Many of you have blocks that are involved in this study already. It's funded by New York Farm Viability Institute, but I don't have any blocks in this study from Saratoga County or the Capital District, and even in areas out of state too would be interesting. The cost, if you want to participate, the cost of that I think would be about $30 per sample just to pay for the mineral analysis. But if you're interested in this, then contact me, and we'll see what we can arrange as we get closer to harvest. So with that, I'm done. I'd take any questions, and I'll turn it over to Mike.
All right, great. Thank you, Dan. If anybody has any questions for Dan, please go ahead and type them into the chat box. Otherwise, we'll move into our final presentation. I do realize we are a little over. My presentation is going to be brief, and I'll also mention that we will have this recording up in the next few days if people do need to get going. But I do encourage you to keep sticking around live. So with that, I'll go ahead and share my presentation. All right, so hopefully everybody can see my screen. Can you see my presentation, Dan?
We can see it.
Yes,
All
yes,
right,
I can
great.
see it fine.
Thank you, Natasha. So I just wanted to quickly review some post-bloom weed management strategies with everybody. So certainly this year, let me back up. As far as weed management goes, we certainly like to think about May through July as being really that critical weed-free period in the orchard. This is really when we're growing fruit, we're also growing the shoots, and so it's really demanding on the trees for both water and nutrition. So to have weeds at this point, you know, they're going to be competing for that water, those nutrients. So we really want to minimize that as much as we can during this timing. And then not only from that May to July period, but as we get further along into the season, we also want to be mindful of what weeds are in the orchard too. Taller weeds can impede our later herbicide treatments that we're putting out. Tall weeds can also serve as habitat for pests that we are going to have in the orchard, and they can also interfere with our harvest operations as we get closer to harvest. So I just wanted to talk about weed management so far. You know, hopefully with the amount of rain we had this season, that should have given ample opportunity in the spring to get a residual application out with some of the various products that we have available. And hopefully that went on either late last fall or sometime this spring. And that should be giving some decent control in a lot of our blocks. But as we get a little bit further on through this critical period, I do highly recommend that as you're making some passes through the orchard or when you're out doing other work in the field, to just keep an eye on the herbicide strip and to see what's coming up. Because when we think about these strategies, the various types of weeds that we have, the diversity of the species, their growth habits that they have, and also the growth stage and height that they're at can really impact the herbicide or weed strategy that we want to employ. So I'll just talk about a couple of the main post-emergent products that we can use during this timing. Certainly paraquat, or gramoxone as the common trade name, is a very common material. This is going to be a contact herbicide. So it's going to be actually burning the tissue back. And so because of that, contact and coverage is really important. So paraquat's a good material specifically for annual broadleaves and for grasses, but it's generally going to be pretty poor on perennials. In general, we're going to get some suppression with paraquat, but it's not really going to kill back because it's just a contact material. It's not going to be getting into the roots or some of the underground structures that some of those perennial plants are going to have. And again, because of it is a contact material and it needs to really cover the foliage, the earlier we can get this material on when the weeds are still small, the better control we're going to have with it. Some other contact materials come from the group 14s. So these include some trade names such as AIM, Trevix, and Venue. So again, these are contacts. Again, generally these are a little more selective than gramoxone. Generally, they're most effective on broadleaves. And again, because they're a contact, generally poor perennial control, you might get some perennial suppression. So these are best used when weeds are small. Again, roughly 2 to 4 inches tall, so we want to be pretty timely with these applications. And these materials in particular are generally most often used in a tanks mix with a systemic product like a glyphosate or maybe a 2,4-D. And what that'll really do is it'll just begin the burn down process as those other materials work a little bit more slowly during this timing. With these different products, each one has a different age restriction, and in general, with really any of the contacts for that matter, we really recommend keeping them off of green trunks, certainly keeping them just on mature callus wood and preferably not touching any of the foliage or the trunk itself. for any of these materials. So now that we talked about the contacts, I will talk about some of our systemic materials that we can also use. Glyphosate, very common. So this is a broad spectrum systemic material that is going to be giving us perennial control. So in order to use glyphosate effectively, timing is really critical. The best timing for glyphosate is when the weeds are healthy and are actively growing, but we don't want to really use it after early July or even earlier than that in a particularly dry year. And the reason for that is later on in the season, the trees are going to be translocating reserves from the leaves down into the roots, and they would be able to carry that glyphosate with it. So in the next spring, that glyphosate would then move from the roots back to the shoots, and we would then see the injury the following spring. So the best use of glyphosate is generally in the early spring, but after we start getting some growth of the weeds themselves. Generally, we recommend avoiding tree contact as much as possible because it is a systemic, really keeping it off of young trees, not to be used on trees less than their third leaf. And another warning that peaches and other stone fruits are extremely sensitive to glyphosate. Some other systemics that we have in a different mode of action would be the auxinic herbicides. And so the two that I'll talk about are 2,4-D and clopyralid. 2,4-D, again, systemic. They're selective, mostly used for annual and perennial broadleaves. The timing for these is, for 2,4-D, it's a fairly volatile compound. So late fall is a common timing for this one, and it will often be used for cleaning up dandelions or other broadleaves that we have in the row middles. We do not want to apply this one to bare ground or to light sandy soils, and we want to make these applications to trees that are at least 1 year old. The other material is clopyralid, trade name stinger or spur. And so these are effective on some key broadleaf weeds, generally clovers, dandelions, very good control for thistle as well. And the general timing that we recommend for clopyralid would be, again, like 2,4-D, that late fall. We want to get this on post-harvest, but before that first frost, because again, because it's systemic, we want to get it on when the weeds are still actively growing and are still relatively healthy. And then the other warning for stinger, again, at least 1 year old trees for this application. So with that, I'm just going to leave this table up here. You can see these are the main post-emergence that we have available to us, along with what their best selectivity is for and minimum tree age requirements. And with that, I'll take any lingering questions, or if anybody has any other questions for any of the presenters, please go ahead, type them into the chat box. I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes, but otherwise, we will go ahead and end here. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Again, I'd like to thank all of our speakers. I would like to thank OESCO again for sponsoring these. And I encourage you, next week we will be meeting at the same time of the week, at the same time, and Terence will be joining us again to discuss thinning strategies for the 12 millimeter timing.